Marcus Webb sat on the edge of a concrete slab in a room that smelled of rust and human waste. The walls were closer than they should have been. The air was thick, humid, pressing against his skin like a wet cloth. Through the bars, he could see a narrow corridor lit by a single fluorescent bulb that flickered every few seconds. Beyond that, nothing, no windows, no daylight, no sense of time except for the ache in his back and the hollow gnawing in his stomach that told him he hadn't eaten in more than a day. He kept replaying the moment. The exact second when everything tilted. A dusty street in Phnom Penh, mid-afternoon sun beating down on cracked pavement. A police officer stepping into the road, hand raised, casual but firm. And Marcus, sitting on his rented scooter, engine idling, not understanding yet that his life was about to change, that saying one word, a single syllable, would lead him here, to this cell, to this silence, to this suffocating realization that he was alone in a country where no one was coming to help him. The word was simple: no. Marcus Webb had always been the kind of man who believed in doing things the right way, not because he was naive, not because he thought the world was fair, but because he believed that principles mattered. That standing firm on something, even something small, was the only way to keep yourself intact. He'd grown up in a middle-class family in Surrey, the kind of upbringing where rules were clear and consequences were predictable. You studied hard, you got a degree, you worked an honest job, you didn't cheat, you didn't lie, you didn't pay bribes to corrupt officials on the side of the road just because everyone else did. At 34, Marcus had built a life that reflected that belief. He worked as a digital marketer for a London-based firm, managing social media campaigns and content strategies from wherever he happened to be. 2 years ago, he'd moved to Chiang Mai, Thailand. The cost of living was low, the internet was fast, the food was incredible. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment near the old city, worked from coffee shops with decent Wi-Fi, and spent weekends exploring. He'd become one of those expats who blended in without fully belonging. He knew enough Thai to order food and negotiate tuk-tuk fares. He understood the unspoken rhythms of Southeast Asia, or at least, he thought he did. Cambodia had been on his list for months. Everyone who passed through Thailand eventually made the trip. Angkor Wat, the killing fields, Phnom Penh's chaotic energy. Marcus had crossed the border on a Friday morning, taking a bus from Bangkok to Siem Reap, then another down to the capital. 4 days, that was the plan. See the temples, eat some street food, take photos for his Instagram, then back to Chiang Mai by Tuesday. Simple, low risk. The kind of trip he'd done a dozen times before in Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar. Phnom Penh greeted him with heat and noise. The streets were a tangle of motorbikes, tuk-tuks, and street vendors selling everything from fried insects to knockoff designer bags. The Mekong River curved along the eastern edge of the city, brown and sluggish under the afternoon sun. Marcus checked into a guest house near the riverfront, a narrow building with peeling paint and a fan that rattled when it turned. The woman at the front desk barely looked up when he signed in. He dropped his backpack on the bed, showered in lukewarm water, and went out to explore. The first day passed without incident. He walked along Sisawath Quay, watched the river, ate grilled fish at a roadside stall. The city had a roughness to it that Bangkok didn't. Fewer tourists, more edge. He liked it. It felt real, unpretentious. On the second day, he decided to rent a scooter. The guest house owner pointed him toward a rental shop 2 blocks away. $50 for 3 days, no questions, no paperwork. Just hand over the cash and take the keys. Marcus wasn't an experienced rider, but he'd gotten comfortable on a scooter during his time in Thailand. The traffic in Phnom Penh was lighter than Bangkok, easier to navigate. He spent the morning riding around the royal palace, stopping to take photos, weaving through side streets where kids played soccer with a deflated ball and old women sat in doorways selling lotus flowers. By early afternoon, he was hungry. He'd heard about the Russian market, a sprawling indoor bazaar where you could find anything from bootleg DVDs to handmade jewelry. It was on the other side of the city, maybe 20 minutes by scooter. He set off just after 2. The sun was high, brutal. The streets shimmered with heat. He followed the main road south, then turned east onto a quieter street lined with low concrete buildings and shuttered shops. Traffic thinned. The noise of the city faded slightly. He was maybe 10 minutes from the market when he saw the officer. The man stepped out from the side of the road, one hand raised, the other resting casually on his belt. He wasn't in full uniform, just a faded blue shirt with some kind of badge stitched onto the chest. Dark trousers, worn boots. His face was weathered, creased by sun and years. He looked like he'd been standing in that spot all afternoon, waiting. Marcus slowed, stopped, turned off the engine. The officer walked over, said something in Khmer. Marcus shook his head, offered a small smile. Sorry, I don't speak Khmer. English? The officer nodded. His English was broken but functional. You run red light. Marcus frowned. He looked back down the street. There was no traffic light, not for at least 2 blocks. He'd been watching. He always watched. No, Marcus said. There was no red light. The officer's expression didn't change. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket, flipped it open. Red light. You run. Is fine. You pay. Marcus felt the first flicker of unease. He'd heard about this. Everyone who traveled in Southeast Asia had heard about this. Traffic stops that weren't really traffic stops. Fines that weren't really fines. Small shakedowns designed to extract money from tourists who didn't know better or didn't want the hassle. Most people paid. $20, $50, whatever the officer asked. It was easier than arguing, cheaper than the alternative. But Marcus didn't believe in paying bribes. It was a principle he'd held on to even when it was inconvenient. Even when friends told him he was being stubborn. Corruption thrived because people enabled it. Because they took the easy way out. If everyone just said no, the system would collapse. That's what Marcus believed. That's what he'd always believed. I didn't run a red light, Marcus said, keeping his voice calm but firm. There's no light here. I don't owe a fine. The officer tilted his head slightly. His expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of recognition. This wasn't going to be easy. This fine, the officer repeated. $300. 300. The number hung in the air between them. Marcus almost laughed. It was absurd. Even if he had run a red light, $300 was extortion. I'm not paying that, Marcus said. I didn't do anything wrong. The officer looked at him for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone, turned away, made a call. Marcus couldn't hear what he was saying. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds. When the officer turned back, his face was harder. You come with me. We go station. Sort out. Marcus hesitated. His instinct told him to refuse, to get back on the scooter and ride away. But he was in a foreign country. He didn't know the laws. He didn't know what would happen if he just left. And part of him, the part that still believed in fairness, thought maybe this was actually the right move. Maybe at the station there would be someone who spoke better English, someone who could see this was a misunderstanding, someone who would let him go. 2 more officers arrived within minutes. They pulled up on motorbikes, parked on either side of Marcus's scooter. Neither of them spoke. They just looked at him, waited. The first officer gestured down the street. You follow. Not far. Marcus's hands were shaking slightly as he started the engine. He told himself this was fine. This was just bureaucracy. A misunderstanding that would get cleared up in an hour, maybe less. He'd be back at the guest house by dinner. He'd have a story to tell, the time he got pulled over in Cambodia and stood his ground. He followed the officers through a maze of side streets, away from the main roads, deeper into a part of the city he didn't recognize. The buildings here were older, more rundown. Walls covered in grime and graffiti, stray dogs sleeping in patches of shade. After about 10 minutes, they pulled into a narrow alley and stopped in front of a nondescript concrete building. No signs, no flags, just a metal door and a small window covered with bars. The first officer got off his bike, motioned for Marcus to do the same, inside. Marcus parked the scooter, took off his helmet. His mouth was dry. He followed the officer through the door into a dim hallway that smelled of cigarette smoke and mildew. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was cracked tile. There were voices somewhere deeper in the building, muffled and distant. The officer led him to a small room at the end of the hall. A desk, 2 chairs, a fan spinning slowly in the corner. Wait here. The door closed. Marcus sat down. The room was stifling. He pulled out his phone, checked the time. He tried to steady his breathing. This was fine. This was just a process. He'd explain what happened. They'd realize there was no red light. He'd leave. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, then longer, the certainty began to crack. No one came to explain anything. No one asked for his side of the story. The door stayed closed. The fan kept spinning. And Marcus Webb, sitting in that airless room in a police station somewhere in Phnom Penh, began to understand that the world didn't operate the way he thought it did. That principle, in the wrong place at the wrong time, could cost more than he was prepared to pay. The door opened at 4:30. Marcus had been watching the second hand on his watch crawl around the face for over an hour. A different officer entered, older than the first, maybe 50, with graying hair slicked back and a face that revealed nothing. He wore a proper uniform, crisply pressed, with insignia Marcus didn't recognize. He sat down across from Marcus without introducing himself, placed a folder on the desk, didn't open it. "You refused to pay fine," the officer said. His English was better. That somehow made it worse. Marcus straightened in his chair. "There was no red light. I didn't break any law. This is a mistake." The officer's expression didn't change. "You argue with police officer. You refuse to comply. This is serious offense in Cambodia, disrespecting authority, obstructing justice." He said the words slowly, deliberately, like he'd said them many times before. "I'm not disrespecting anyone," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just want to understand what I'm being charged with, what law I broke. There has to be some kind of process here. Paperwork, something official." The officer leaned back in his chair. "Process is simple. You pay fine. You leave. You continue holiday." He paused. "Or you refuse. Then we have problem." Marcus felt sweat running down his back. The room was stifling, the air thick and still. "How much?" $300. "Cash now." It was the same number. Marcus had expected it to change, to be negotiable, to be revealed as the scam it obviously was. But the officer's face showed no hint of deception. He looked like he was discussing the weather. Routine, mundane. This was just another day for him. "I don't have $300 in cash," Marcus said. It was true. He carried maybe $60 in his wallet, some Thai baht, a credit card. "And I'm not paying for something I didn't do." The officer opened the folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in Khmer script, pointed to something near the bottom. "This is report. Officer says you run red light. You refuse to stop. You argue. All here. You sign. You pay. You go. You refuse. This becomes court matter. Very expensive. Very long time." Marcus stared at the paper. He couldn't read a word of it. For all he knew, it said he'd murdered someone. "I want to speak to someone from the British Embassy. That's my right." The officer shrugged. "You can call. No problem." He pulled a phone from his pocket, slid it across the desk. An old Nokia with a cracked screen. "Call." Marcus picked up the phone. His hands were shaking now. He dialed the emergency number for the British Embassy in Phnom Penh, a number he'd saved in his own phone before leaving Thailand. It rang, and rang, and rang, then clicked over to voicemail. A recorded message in crisp British English informing him that the embassy was closed and would reopen at 8:30 the following morning. If this was an emergency, please press 1. He pressed 1. The line rang again, no answer. He hung up. Tried again, same result. The officer watched him with mild interest. "Embassy closed now, is after 5. He took the phone back. "You stay here tonight. Try again tomorrow." "Stay here?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "I'm not staying here. I haven't done anything wrong. You refuse to pay fine. This is problem now. Cannot leave until resolved." The officer stood up, collected his folder. "You think about it. Maybe tomorrow you change mind." He walked to the door, knocked twice. Another officer appeared, younger, with a flat expression and a nightstick hanging from his belt. The older officer said something in Khmer. The younger one nodded, gestured for Marcus to stand. "Wait," Marcus said. "Where are we going?" No one answered. He was led back down the hallway, but this time they turned toward a staircase at the rear of the building, concrete steps descending into darkness. The smell hit him before he reached the bottom. Urine, sweat, something else, something rotten and organic that made his stomach turn. The stairs opened into a narrow corridor lined with metal bars, cells. He could see shapes moving behind the bars, hear breathing, low voices murmuring in a language he didn't understand. The officer stopped in front of the third cell, pulled out a key. The door swung open with a metallic screech. Inside, 5 men sat or lay on a concrete floor barely larger than a parking space. They looked up when the door opened. Their faces were hollow, unshaven, eyes that had seen too much. The officer pushed Marcus forward. He stumbled inside. The door slammed shut behind him. The lock clicked. For a moment, Marcus just stood there. He couldn't process what was happening. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. He was a British citizen, a tourist. He had rights. There were rules, procedures. You didn't just lock someone in a cell because they refused to pay a bribe. That's not how the world worked. But the bars were real. The concrete floor was real. The smell was real. The 5 men watching him from the shadows were real. And slowly, with a nauseating certainty, Marcus understood that everything he believed about how the world worked was irrelevant here. One of the men said something in Khmer. Marcus shook his head. "English? Does anyone speak English?" A man in the corner, maybe 40, with a scar running down his left cheek, nodded slightly. Little bit. You tourist? Yes. I mean, I'm living in Thailand, but I'm here visiting. This is a mistake. They're saying I ran a red light, but I didn't. There was no red light. The man with the scar smiled, but there was no humor in it. Everyone here, no crime. Everyone innocent. He gestured around the cell. But we all here. Marcus felt his legs weaken. He slid down the wall, sat on the floor. The concrete was cold despite the heat. How long have you been here? 2 months. Maybe 3. I don't know anymore. For what? The man shrugged. They say I steal motorbike. I didn't steal. Was my cousin motorbike. But cousin, he don't come say this, so I stay. Marcus looked around the cell. No beds, no toilet except for a hole in the corner with a bucket next to it. No window. Just a single overhead bulb behind a metal grate that cast everything in sickly yellow light. The walls were covered in streaks of something dark. The floor was stained. One man was sleeping, curled up against the wall. Another sat with his knees pulled to his chest, rocking slightly. No one looked at Marcus. They'd seen people like him before. Foreigners who thought they were different, who thought their passports meant something, who learned too late that down here, in the dark, everyone was the same. Night fell, though Marcus only knew because the sounds outside changed. The voices grew quieter. Somewhere in the building, a radio played Khmer pop music. The heat didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. The cell became a sauna. Marcus's shirt stuck to his back. His mouth was dry, throat parched. He'd been offered no water, no food. He'd asked the man with the scar if they would bring dinner. The man had laughed that same humorless laugh. Maybe tomorrow, if you're lucky. Marcus tried to sleep. He couldn't. The floor was too hard. The smell was too strong. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced. He thought about the British embassy. He'd call again in the morning. Explain everything. They'd sort this out. They had to. He thought about his friends in Chiang Mai. They knew he was in Cambodia, but they didn't know where exactly. They wouldn't expect to hear from him for days. He thought about his family back in the UK, his mother who worried every time he traveled, his father who'd always said Southeast Asia was too risky, too unpredictable. Marcus had always brushed off those concerns. He'd been fine for 2 years. He knew what he was doing. But lying on that concrete floor, listening to the man in the corner cough and spit, Marcus realized he didn't know anything at all. Morning came slowly. Gray light filtered down from somewhere above, though Marcus never saw the source. One of the men stood up, used the bucket in the corner. No privacy. No dignity. Marcus turned away. His stomach was cramping from hunger. His head pounded. He needed water. He needed to brush his teeth. He needed to get out of here. Around 8, a guard appeared. Not the one from last night. A different man, shorter, with a bored expression. He slid a tray through a slot at the bottom of the bars. Rice, plain white rice in a dented metal bowl, nothing else. The men in the cell moved quickly, dividing it among themselves. There wasn't enough for everyone. Marcus got maybe 3 spoonfuls. It was cold, slightly sour. He forced it down. Please, Marcus called out to the guard. I need to make a phone call, the British embassy. I need to call them. The guard looked at him, said something in Khmer, walked away. Marcus spent the day in a fog of heat and thirst. Someone brought water around noon, lukewarm, tasted like rust. Marcus drank it anyway. His lips were cracked. His tongue felt swollen. The man with the scar told him the trick was to think about something else, anything else. Don't think about the heat. Don't think about the smell. Don't count the hours. Just let time pass. Become empty. But Marcus couldn't empty himself. His mind kept circling back to the same question. How did he end up here? He'd said no. That was all. He'd refused to participate in corruption. He'd stood on principle. And this was the result. A cell, concrete, darkness. Men who'd been forgotten by the world. On the 3rd day, a guard came and told him he could make his call. Marcus was taken upstairs, given the same cracked Nokia. He dialed the embassy again. This time someone answered. A woman with a calm, professional voice. Marcus explained everything, where he was, what had happened, the false accusation, the cell. He tried to keep his voice steady, but he could hear the desperation creeping in. The woman listened, took notes, asked for his passport number. Right, she said when he finished. We'll look into this. It may take some time. The Cambodian legal system can be quite slow. In the meantime, do not sign anything you don't understand and try to remain calm. I've been in a cell for 3 days, Marcus said, with no food, no water, no explanation. When is someone coming to get me out? There was a pause. We can't interfere in local legal proceedings, Mr. Webb. but we'll monitor the situation and do what we can to ensure you're treated fairly. Monitor the situation. The words hit Marcus like cold water. No one was coming. No one was going to walk in and demand his release. He was alone. He was taken back downstairs, back to the cell. That afternoon, the older officer returned. He stood outside the bars, looked at Marcus with the same flat expression. "You ready to pay now?" Marcus stood up. His legs were weak. "Yes, I'll pay. Just let me out." The officer shook his head. "Now is $600. You wait too long. His processing fee, court cost, everything add up." Marcus felt something break inside him. "I don't have $600. I told you, I don't have that kind of cash." "Then you stay. When you have money, you call family. They send. Then you go." "How long?" The officer shrugged. "Depend on you." He walked away. Marcus sank back down to the floor. The man with the scar looked at him. "Now you understand. It's not about law. It's not about right or wrong. It's about money. Always money." A week passed, maybe more. Marcus lost track. The days blurred together. Rice twice a day. Rust water. The bucket in the corner. The heat. The smell. Men came and went. Some paid, some didn't. Some were transferred to other cells. Marcus stayed. Then one morning, 2 guards came. They pulled him out of the cell, led him out the stairs, out into blinding sunlight. A truck waited outside, metal cage in the back. 5 other prisoners already inside. The guards pushed Marcus in, locked the door. The truck started moving. They drove for maybe an hour, through parts of Phnom Penh Marcus didn't recognize, industrial areas, fields, concrete walls topped with barbed wire. Then the truck stopped in front of massive gates, a sign in Khmer and English, Prey Sar Prison. Marcus had heard the name before. A notorious facility on the outskirts of the city, overcrowded, violent, the place where people went when the system swallowed them whole. The gates opened. The truck pulled inside. The door was unlocked. Marcus stepped out into a courtyard surrounded by high walls. Guards with rifles watched from towers. Prisoners in faded blue uniforms moved slowly in the heat. The noise was overwhelming. Shouting, clanging metal. Somewhere, someone was screaming. Marcus was processed. Fingerprints. Poto. His belongings taken. He was given a thin mat and led to a cell block. The door opened, and he saw 30 men packed into a space meant for maybe 10. Concrete bunks stacked 3 high, a single toilet in the corner with no door. The smell was worse than the holding cell, exponentially worse. Men lay on the floor because there was no room on the bunks. Others sat against walls, staring at nothing. Marcus was pushed inside. The door closed. He stood there, holding his mat, surrounded by strangers in a prison in Cambodia, and realized that his principal, his refusal to pay $300, had cost him everything. The British embassy was monitoring the situation. His friends thought he was sightseeing. His family didn't know where he was. And here, in Prey Sar, justice didn't exist. Only survival. Only time. Only the slow, crushing weight of a system that operated on rules he'd never learned. Rules that had nothing to do with fairness. Nothing to do with right or wrong. A system built on broken laws and unspoken transactions, where saying no wasn't brave. It was just expensive. And Marcus Webb, sitting on a concrete floor in a cell packed with forgotten men, finally understood that some lessons could only be learned in the dark. Marcus learned the rules of Prey Sar within 48 hours, not from any official orientation or handbook, but from watching, from listening, from making mistakes and seeing how quickly the consequences came. The first rule was space. There were 32 men in a cell built for 12. Every square foot mattered. Where you sat, where you slept, where you placed your mat. The concrete bunks belonged to men who'd been there longest or who had money to pay for the privilege. The floor was divided into invisible territories, negotiated through a complex system Marcus didn't understand but had to respect. He placed his mat too close to another man's claimed area on the first night. The man, gaunt and scarred, had simply picked up the mat and thrown it against the wall. No words, no explanation needed. Marcus moved it, found a spot near the toilet where no one else wanted to be. That became his space. The second rule was currency. Everything in Prey Sar operated on transactions. Cigarettes were the primary medium. A single cigarette could buy you an extra portion of rice. A pack could buy you a phone call. 3 packs could buy you a spot on a bunk for a week. Marcus didn't smoke, but he quickly understood he needed cigarettes anyway. The guards sold them, $2 a pack. But Marcus had no money. His wallet, his phone, his credit cards all taken during processing. He had nothing. The third rule was silence about the outside world. Half the men in the cell had been there for months, some for years. Their cases stuck in a legal system that moved like mud, talking about freedom, about plans for after release, about the life they left behind, only made the present more unbearable. So no one talked about it. They talked about food, about women, about the small dramas of prison life, but never about what they'd lost. Marcus tried to follow the rules. He kept his head down. He didn't complain. He didn't ask questions. But the first week was agony. The heat during the day was suffocating. At night, the concrete absorbed none of it. Bodies pressed together. The smell of sweat and unwashed skin became a constant presence, something he tasted in the back of his throat. The toilet overflowed regularly. Waste ran across the floor until someone cleaned it, which happened irregularly and only when the smell became so overpowering that even the guards complained. Food arrived twice a day, rice and watery soup, sometimes a few vegetables, never meat. The portions were small, calculated to keep men alive but never satisfied. Marcus lost weight rapidly. He could feel his ribs after a week. His face became hollow. His clothes hung loose. Hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing ache that colored everything. But worse than the hunger was the boredom. The hours stretched endlessly. There was nothing to do, no books, no activities. Men sat and stared. Some played cards with a deck so worn the numbers were barely visible. Others slept during the day to escape the monotony. Marcus tried to keep track of time. He scratched marks on the wall near his mat. 1 line per day. But even that became depressing. Watching the marks accumulate, seeing his life measured in scratches on concrete. On his 10th day, a man named Sareth started talking to him. Sareth was Cambodian, maybe 35, with a thin frame and quick eyes. His English was decent, learned from tourists during his years working as a tuk-tuk driver in Siem Reap. He'd been in Praesar for 7 months, arrested for a debt he couldn't pay. A loan from a local businessman that had ballooned with interest. When Sareth couldn't pay, the businessman claimed it was theft, filed a police report, had Sareth arrested. Now Sareth sat in prison while his wife and 2 children tried to survive without him. "System here not like your country," Sareth said. They were sitting against the wall, sharing shade from the single window. "Here, police work for who pay them. Court work for who pay them. You have money, you have justice. No money, no justice. Very simple." Marcus had figured that much out, but hearing it stated so plainly, so matter-of-factly, made it real in a way he'd been resisting. "The British Embassy," Marcus said. "They're supposed to be monitoring my situation." Sareth smiled, not unkindly. "Monitor? Yes, they monitor. But they not get you out. Embassy help with paperwork, maybe visit. But they cannot change Cambodian law, cannot force police to release you. You understand? You here until you pay. That is only way." "I don't have money," Marcus said. "Then you call family. They send." Marcus had thought about that. Every day he thought about it. His parents lived on modest pensions. His brother had a young family, a mortgage. Asking them for money, especially money to pay what amounted to extortion, felt like admitting defeat, like validating the entire corrupt system. But as the days passed, as the scratches on the wall accumulated, his resistance weakened. On day 15, he was allowed a phone call. The guards had a system. $5 for 3 minutes. Marcus had convinced another prisoner, a Frenchman named Laurent, who'd been arrested for overstaying his visa, to spot him the money in exchange for promising to pay him back double when he got out. Laurent had shrugged and agreed. He'd been in prison long enough to know that promises meant nothing, but he gave Marcus the cigarettes anyway. Marcus called his mother. Hearing her voice, clear and worried and so impossibly far away, nearly broke him. He kept his voice steady, explained where he was. What had happened, she cried. He could hear his father in the background asking questions. Marcus gave them the details, the false accusation, the prison, the amount they were asking for. $2,000. His mother said they'd find it. They'd send it however he needed. Marcus gave them the information for the local NGO that Laurent had mentioned, an organization that worked with foreign prisoners. Then the 3 minutes were up. The line went dead. The waiting was worse than anything that had come before. Days passed, then a week. Marcus heard nothing. He imagined every possible disaster. The money lost, the transfer blocked, his parents scammed by someone claiming to help. He scratched marks on the wall, watched men come and go. A new prisoner arrived, a young Australian who'd been caught with drugs. He lasted 2 days before breaking down completely. sobbing in the corner until the guards came and took him somewhere else. Marcus didn't know where. No one talked about it. On day 28, a representative from the NGO visited, a Cambodian woman in her 40s named Channery. She spoke quietly with Marcus through the bars, explained that his parents had sent the money. The process was complicated. There were fees, bribes that needed to be paid to move things along. The British embassy was involved now, applying pressure, but slowly. Everything here moved slowly. She couldn't promise when he'd be released, but she was working on it. She brought him a package: soap, a toothbrush, a clean shirt, a book in English. Small things that felt like treasures. Marcus asked her about the others, the men who'd been there for months, years. Channery's face darkened. Some have no one to help them, no family with money, no embassy that cares. They wait. Sometimes court eventually processes their case. Sometimes they're just forgotten. The book was a worn paperback, a thriller about a man wrongly accused of murder. Marcus read it in 2 days, then read it again. It was an escape, a way to leave the cell without moving. When he finished the second time, he passed it to Sareth, who couldn't read English well but liked to practice. Sareth passed it to someone else. The book made its way around the cell, a small piece of the outside world circulating through the dark. Day 35, Channery visited again. The paperwork was almost ready. The money had been processed. The police were being difficult, but she'd found someone who could expedite things. 3 more days, maybe 4. Marcus didn't let himself hope. Hope was dangerous here. Hope made time move slower. But on day 40, the guards came for him, not roughly, but with bureaucratic indifference. Told him to collect his things. Marcus looked at Sareth. The man nodded, said nothing. What was there to say? Marcus was leaving. Sareth was staying. That was the way it worked. Marcus was taken to an office. Channery was there, a police official. Papers were signed. The official explained, through Channery's translation, that Marcus was being released, but was prohibited from returning to Cambodia for 5 years. His scooter rental had never been returned, so he owed additional fines for that. Those fines were waived in exchange for his immediate departure. Marcus signed everything put in front of him. He didn't read any of it. He just wanted out. His belongings were returned. Phone, wallet, passport. The phone was dead. The wallet still had the $60 he'd been carrying, which felt absurd. They'd taken 43 days of his life for money he'd been carrying all along. Channery drove him to the Thai border. It was a 4-hour drive. They barely spoke. Marcus stared out the window at the countryside. Rice fields. Villages, normal life happening as if nothing had changed. When they reached the border crossing, Channery handed him a sealed envelope. "From your parents," she said. "Enough for a ticket home." Marcus thanked her. She nodded. Told him to take care of himself. Drove away. He crossed into Thailand. Took a bus to Bangkok. Found a cheap hotel near Khao San Road. Showered for the first time in over a month. The water was hot. Clean. He stood under it until it ran cold. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. He'd lost maybe 20 pounds. His face was gaunt. His eyes were different. Older, harder. He flew back to the UK 3 days later. His parents met him at Heathrow. His mother hugged him and didn't let go. His father looked at him with an expression Marcus couldn't read. Concern, relief. Something else. Maybe disappointment. Maybe just sadness at what had been taken from his son. Marcus moved back into his childhood bedroom. He didn't talk about Cambodia. When people asked, he said the trip had been cut short. A misunderstanding with authorities. He was fine now, but he wasn't fine. He couldn't sleep. Every night, he woke up thinking he was back in the cell. The smell, the heat, the scratches on the wall. He'd sit up in bed, heart racing, and have to remind himself where he was, that he was free, that the bars were gone. But they weren't gone. Not really. He carried them with him. In the way he flinched when he saw a police officer. In the way he couldn't eat a full meal without feeling guilty. In the way he'd become quiet around his friends, unable to explain where he'd been or what had happened. They knew vaguely that he'd had some trouble abroad, but they didn't know about the cell, the men, the way time stopped meaning anything after the first week. Months passed. Marcus got a job in London, went through the motions. But something fundamental had shifted. His principle, the thing he'd thought made him strong, now felt like a liability. He believed that standing firm mattered, that saying no to corruption was important, that if everyone just refused to participate, the system would change. But the system hadn't changed. It had swallowed him whole and then spit him out when his family paid enough money to grease the wheels. His 43 days in Praesar hadn't exposed injustice or sparked reform. They'd just been 43 days, time lost, life interrupted. And the men he'd left behind, Sereth and the others, were still there, still waiting, still forgotten. Marcus thought about that often, whether his stand had meant anything, whether refusing that first $300 bribe had been brave or just naive, whether principle was something that mattered in the world or just something that mattered to him. He'd wanted to believe that individual choices accumulated, that small acts of resistance added up to something larger. But maybe they didn't. Maybe in systems built on power and money and indifference, principle was just another word for privilege, the luxury of people who'd never had to choose between their values and their freedom. He didn't have an answer, not one that satisfied him. He just had the memory, the concrete floor, the scratches on the wall. The men who'd taught him that survival meant learning to let go of the things you thought defined you, that in the dark, in the heat, in the silence, the only thing that mattered was making it to the next day. Marcus Webb was free now, back in his own country, his own bed, his own life. But Praesar stayed with him, in the way he checked over his shoulder, in the way he counted his money differently, seeing it not as currency but as freedom measured in dollars, and the way he sometimes woke up and, for just a moment, couldn't remember which side of the bars he was on. Some prisons you walk out of, others you carry. And the question that haunted Marcus, the one he turned over endlessly in the quiet hours, was whether his 43 days had changed anything in Cambodia, whether one man saying no had rippled out into something larger, or whether it had only changed him, hollowed him out, taught him that the world didn't operate on fairness but on transactions, and that principle, in the end, was something you could only afford when you had the money to pay for it. When you didn't, it was just the bars you built for yourself, the cell you carried long after the door unlocked, the price of believing the world should be different than it is.